So at the end of a meeting yesterday, people said, we've elected a pope. My assistant says, yeah, and my husband says it's a Jesuit. I said, he's got to be wrong. There's only one Jesuit elector who's at the conclave. So I said, he's got to be wrong. So I went online to take a look and see, and lo and behold, he wasn't wrong. We were just stunned, all of us. So yesterday afternoon, Jesuits were calling each other. I got calls from John Carroll alums all over the country celebrating this and saying, can you imagine? And my response was usually, no, we can't really imagine, because the likelihood of this was so small. But what I talk to people about is in the last 2 weeks, we've been praying that the Holy Spirit give us the Pope we need. Now, Ignatius, our founder, would say, the Holy Spirit leads the church. This election of a Jesuit is the Holy Spirit leading the church. Now, where that leads and what happens, we don't know yet. But we know the Spirit is leading us, especially with an outcome as unlikely as this. Jesuits, because of St. Ignatius' concern about how we need to, in his day, 1540, how we need to change the church. He said Jesuits won't be involved in the politics of the church, and they won't seek church positions. And so by and large, that meant you had 2 possible Jesuits who were part of the college electing, because a couple other Jesuits had turned 80 and were no longer elected. So you have a handful of Jesuit cardinals in the world, and Jesuit bishops that number a few dozen, because the Vatican, the Pope, has asked a Jesuit to do this, knowing that Jesuits aren't really prepared to be bishops. That's not part of our experience. Very few of us work within diocesan structures or church structures. So our tradition from 1540 until now, the fact that Jesuits have only existed for 500 years, that's one of the reasons there hasn't been a Jesuit Pope. But the other reason is there are very few Jesuit cardinals, because we're not on that track. Ignatius was so concerned about the church in his day, and he thought the church needs to be more responsive to both the Holy Spirit, but also to the pastoral needs of the people. In the early day, in that Middle Age period, Ignatius was concerned that bishops especially lived very well and didn't have much pastoral concern. That would have been the primary piece. The bishops would have been hanging out with royalty from all over Europe. They would have been focused on how to lead legislatively their diocese. And Ignatius said, we really need to be focused on the people and focused on how we respond to God. This is part of what makes us so excited about Pope Francis. One, the choice of that name, Francis of Assisi, also a reformer in the church. It's important to remember Francis of Assisi was not a priest, but was a lay reformer in the church. The Franciscans and the Jesuits are 2 large orders, as the Wall Street Journal pointed out, that haven't always gotten along, because we have different views of how you change the world, how you change the church. Jesuits are focused on, again, responding to that call of the Holy Spirit, but as you've seen in this country, education, as we saw around the world from our founding, missionary work, the training of younger Jesuits, the great institutions that we run in Rome to train priests and doctoral students and lay people, and the fact that we do that here. We are delighted to have a pastoral pope. He was superior of a Jesuit province before that, the province of Argentina. We are excited, like Jesuits of today, since Vatican II, his commitment to justice, his concern for the poor. Jesuits are excited that he, like all of us, were formed by the spiritual exercises and by the tradition of Ignatius. Now you have to stop and think. We're talking about popes for 2,000 years. Columbus landed in America 500 and some years ago. So a quarter of that time. At one level, not a shock, but given how many Catholics there are, especially in Latin America, the first bishop from the Americas is huge. And while he didn't refer to it, I'm sure he's thinking back to the 1400s and the first, 1500s, and the first Jesuits to come to North America that came into upstate New York, and many of them martyred. And we refer to them as the martyrs of North America, or if you're north of the border, the martyrs of Canada. That's very much a part of the history of Jesuits in this country, is the fact that so many of our brothers were martyred early on as they tried to bring the gospel to the native and indigenous people. At one level, people are expecting change. And as I read comments over the last day, a lot of people are cautioning. And part of that is, as we have experienced, change doesn't happen all that fast in the church. What I don't know is what his concept of the Vatican bureaucracy is. Because part of what we've read over the last few weeks is a desire on the part of some cardinals and others that the church leadership structure change in some way. What we hope for from him is, obviously he will give a new focus on living a simpler lifestyle. Now, I joke with people, does that mean the end of the red shoes? I'm not sure. If he chose to do that, that would be wonderful. Now, we also learned in the last week, those shoes were not Prada, but still, red shoes, it sounds more like royalty. That's not the trappings he's going to put on. While we try to respect the tradition of the church, I expect that he will say in a variety of ways, why don't we do this differently? As Cardinal Wuerl said when he went off to the conclave, he said, we need, even if we do not change theology, any of our teaching, we need to talk about our teaching in a more compelling way. And I would add, and I believe the Cardinal intended, in a way that engages the concerns, the hopes, the disappointments of God's people. So the social issues are going to be in the forefront of his mind. The other thing is, like every other change of leadership in any organization, you think about what you had and you think about what you could do better. What he clearly brings is a more connected pastoral person, very concerned about the social issues, but unique in a sense, maybe somewhat reflective of Pope John Paul II. He's coming from a country that lived with a military junta government. He was able to engage that, not to the pleasure of any one group, because we've heard this over the last days. That's disappointing, but that's the reality. So if he can deal in a social environment like Argentina, and the people seem to be ecstatic over this election, that too is hopeful. We need a pope who will inspire us. And the fact that he's a person from the third world, that I believe has already invigorated people. And so he, as you know, he's older. So this is not likely to be a long papacy. But that, again, we rely upon the Spirit of God to lead us even through that.